you very much, Ari, and a reminder, Ari and Peter and our next two speakers will all be sitting up front for questions and answers after all four speakers. So it's my pleasure to introduce Heather Stricker Orlovsky. I just learned you have an additional name. Heather Stricker is a Wildlife Resources Program Director for the Forest County Potawatomi. Please welcome Heather.
Thank you. Good morning. So during the course of developing this presentation, I ended up finding myself reading law reviews, 40, 50-page law reviews, kind of just going over some things that are a bit of new territory for me. But as I did that, I realized that my mind kept coming back to this. I wouldn't say it's a quote, more of just an excerpt from a law review that I had read. Again, 40-page, 50-page law review, and it was this one sentence that I kept coming back to. And originally I had slipped it into the presentation somewhere in the middle, and then I realized that this one sentence so well embodies kind of such a big concept about within my talk that I decided to put it kind of front and center, first slide, so that we can take a look at this sentence and keep it in mind as we go along in the presentation. So it's a line taken from one of the many works of Professor Mary Wood, who's a law professor and faculty director of the Environmental and Natural Resources Law Program at the University of Oregon. So it reads, "The tribal harvest right is nearly meaningless within a context of modern species imperilment." So it's a short statement, again, taken from these 40 pages of review, but yet it's so profound. And argues that treaty rights regarding wildlife must, in a modern context, inherently encompass the right for tribes to conserve and protect wild populations, not just harvest, because without thriving populations, a harvest right is utterly meaningless. So to provide a context and a little understanding of this statement, we need to look at the history of tribal treaties and Native peoples' access to wildlife resources. Native Americans, as many people know, once occupied almost 2 billion acres of land in the United States and now occupy less than 4% of their original land. So as these borders receded, the borders of the reservations receded, so too did their jurisdiction over natural capital, things such as wildlife, plants, water, etc. So trusteeship over these resources were then transferred to the federal agencies as lands were ceded, and then, of course, eventually to the states as the states were formed. The treaties, however, that were signed explicitly guaranteed the tribes access to wild game and plants and further to pursue native ways of life. These promises were made by the federal government based on protecting them from the threats known to those times, things such as settler encroachment and therefore settler exploitation of wild game, aggression from non-Indians, and government intrusion on the Indian way of life. This became known as the Federal Indian Trust Responsibility. There it is. So this was being discussed as early as 1831 by Chief Justice John Marshall. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs website defines the Federal Indian Trust Responsibility as a legal obligation under which the United States has charged itself with moral obligations of the highest responsibility and trust toward Indian tribes. And this is a legally enforceable fiduciary responsibility to protect tribal treaty rights, lands, assets, and resources. Over the years, this trust doctrine has been at the center of numerous Supreme Court cases, making it one of the most important principles in federal Indian law. Despite this, though, analyses of these policies that have been created under this doctrine have shown that these policies have largely failed to ensure the protection of tribal assets. It's possible that this lack of protection is due, at least in part, to a failure to adapt the interpretation of treaty rights to address modern threats, including the precipitous decline of wildlife populations and political and special interest mismanagement of cross-jurisdictional resources. There it goes. So in a modern context, much of the conflict arises over jurisdictional management rights between states and tribes and how to manage and allocate dwindling resources. Unfortunately, many times treaty rights are interpreted only in the sense of a harvest right or the right to wildlife yield as opposed to wildlife capital. So wildlife capital being the resource as a whole or the body of the resource belonging to everybody or belonging to nobody, depending on how you look at it. and entrusted to sovereign governments to protect into perpetuity. Wildlife yield, on the other hand, are the harvested number of individuals taken out of that resource body and allocated to private individuals, usually on a permit or license basis. So given the federal fiduciary responsibility to guard tribal resources and maintain access to them, as well as the guaranteed right to pursue native ways of life, is a sustainable resource, wildlife resource, a treaty right? Do the states then have a responsibility to sustainably manage cross-jurisdictional resources, even if the tribes have no intention to harvest them? And more importantly, do the states have a right to disregard the input of tribes as sovereign co-managers? So this concept is particularly prudent in areas such as the Great Lakes, where we can see on this map, with the pink being tribal reservation lands. It's particularly prudent in the Great Lakes because reservations are so small and land bases are so fragmented, and generally lack exterior boundaries. So as we can see on this map of tribal lands in the United States, comparatively, reservation lands in the east, if you can even see it, there's a few reservations in Florida, New York State, and then of course Michigan and Wisconsin. They're very small compared to the reservations out in the west. And in fact, some reservations are so small that they actually don't even appear, if this will work. I don't know what happened here. There it goes, okay. They don't even appear on this map due to scale. That's how small some of these reservation lands are. And Forest County Potawatomi community is no exception. So we can see right here, the Forest County Potawatomi lands in northeastern Wisconsin. It's about 17 to 18,000 acres of land, mostly in Forest County, Wisconsin. So it's easy to see from this map that whatever is happening off of reservation lands is going to directly impact the ability for tribes to manage their own resources, even on reservation lands, because what's happening off is going to directly impact the resources that are on reservation. And in fact, in light of, on the topic of wolves, in fact, there were only 2 packs that were confirmed to be crossing over into tribal lands on a regular basis. And since 2011, both of those packs have been lost, one due to poaching and one presumably due to legal hunting. And since 2012, we haven't had a record of wolves on tribal lands. And the modern threats are mounting. Again, these small disjunct reservations and the lack of an exterior boundary complicates management strategies, and it often results in less federal funding for conservation and research. Small land bases also are at much greater risk of experiencing negative consequences from environmental damage that's happening off-reservation. These are things such as off-reservation resource depletion, adjacent development and mineral extraction, socioeconomic globalization factors, and climate change. Some tribes, including Forest County Potawatomi, have little to no off-reservation harvesting rights or management rights. Therefore, when species distributions shift, the tribe can experience a total loss of the resource, such as what has happened with the wolf on Forest County Potawatomi lands. Therefore, responsible management off-reservation is often imperative for sustaining populations of wildlife resources on reservation. So as such, as an aspect of tribal sovereignty and federally guaranteed rights to resources, are state wolf and wildlife populations infringing on the tribe's sovereign rights to protect and manage? So this is a question that was addressed in a letter from Glifwick to WDNR Secretary Kathy Stepp regarding the wolf harvest in Wisconsin. Mr. Zorn called attention to the lack of tribal consideration in wolf management and the lack of protection for a wildlife resource that is distributed across the ceded territory and therefore a wildlife treaty resource. The response from the Secretary was that the state had already considered most of the tribes when they set the exterior boundaries of 4 of the 11 reservations, or 36% of the reservations in the state, as no harvest zones. Ms. Stepp also proceeded to assert that the tribes have no jurisdiction or claim over wildlife capital in the state, and any claim to a right to preserve or enhance a resource is an infringement on the state's authority. Interestingly, though, many modern law reviews and federal cases have asserted that tribes do have an inherent authority to protect and a right to co-manage, because without healthy populations, both on and off reservation, harvest rights are basically null. Courts have also recognized pre-treaty native sovereign control over wildlife within Aboriginal territories and reaffirmed the right of American Indian tribes to act as co-managers. courts have dismissed the assertion that states enjoy sole trusteeship over wildlife and held that tribes enjoy the same status. Further, the Supreme Court has proclaimed that any ambiguity in the language of the treaties must be interpreted in ways that favor the tribes. And because Indian treaties are federal law, the Supremacy Clause also prevents the states from enacting laws that override retained treaty rights. And in light of that, it must be understood that treaty rights were not rights given to the tribes by the government, but in fact, they are rights retained by the tribes. But I'm going to do a bit of a 180 here and move beyond these legal obligations. Because while it appears that the tribes do have a right to both wildlife capital and wildlife yield and a right to co-manage, the success of tribes asserting that co-management role has been a bit complicated and hazy. What is quite clear, though, that is despite the legal obstacles, tribes are positioning themselves once again to become excellent stewards over natural resources and wildlife, both in the scientific realm and on the ground conservation. Tribes are conducting scientific research, partnering with federal universities and nonprofits, and becoming nationwide leaders in species conservation, contributing vast amounts of knowledge and resources. Most tribes, as Ari had mentioned, have established their own natural resource departments and are successfully implementing large-scale conservation projects. So a few of those examples include wolf restoration in Idaho, which was accomplished by the Nez Perce tribe, moose monitoring and conservation in Minnesota by the Fond du Lac Chippewa and the 1854 Authority, Pacific salmon recovery, which was coordinated by several Pacific Northwest tribes and the Columbian River Intertribal Fish Commission, lake sturgeon recovery in the Great Lakes, and that's accomplished by several Great Lakes tribes, wildlife overpasses in Montana, which is a huge feat accomplished by the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes with their cooperators, black-footed ferret reintroduction in South Dakota by several South Dakota tribes, bison reintroduction on the Fort Peck and Fort Belknap reservations, swift fox reintroduction, and the list goes on and on. Tribes are also conducting science and publishing peer-reviewed studies all across the country and contributing to the greater body of knowledge regarding species conservation. And these are just a few that I was able to pull out, but there are undoubtedly many, many more examples of this. And noticeably, these projects aren't conducted in a vacuum or confined only to tribal lands and tribal agencies. These are broad-reaching collaborative efforts where multiple agencies, typically spanning state, university, federal, NGOs, came together and understood the benefits of co-management for a mutually agreeable outcome. Tribes are also developing studies that combine both ancient knowledge and modern tools. And so this is kind of a little bit of a plug for myself, but this is a biodiversity hotspot analysis that I conducted on tribal lands using both tribal elder knowledge of plant-animal distributions as well as coordinated field surveys and geospatial analyses. And on that note, more and more traditional ecological knowledge is becoming more accepted and respected as an invaluable source of information for wildlife management and conservation. This is particularly true for investigations that require long-term understanding of complex processes, things such as migrations and long-term patterns. And so one example of that is the bowhead whale in the Beaufort Sea. And this occurred actually in the late 70s, but the International Whaling Commission had put a moratorium on native hunts because Western science estimates had thought that the bowhead whale population had dwindled to less than 1,000 individuals. The Inuit hunters and elders, though, using their own estimates combined from time and experience, estimated the population to be closer to 7,000. They also disputed the Western scientists' contentions that the whales couldn't swim under offshore ice and that they did not feed during migration. So the Western-trained scientists responded by developing a new survey that included this Inuit traditional ecological knowledge, and their new surveys actually did estimate the population to be closer to actually 8,000 than 1,000. Another example of this is caribou management in British Columbia, and the researchers had actually included traditional ecological knowledge at the onset of this study, and they had talked to Tlingit hunters, gatherers, and elders, and were able to come up with a management plan and a habitat selection model that was based on both Western science and traditional knowledge. So in conclusion, the imperative for cooperation with Native tribes on wildlife and natural trust issues is profound. The reasons range from the biological, from a conservation standpoint, where tribes can contribute data, knowledge, traditional information, and a more pristine land base, particularly out west, for things like species reintroductions. And then it ranges to the logistical and the financial, because greater cooperators means more support, more financial support, greater numbers of boots on the ground for conservation efforts. And lastly, the fiduciary responsibility of both federal and, I argue, state governments for protecting both tribal and non-tribal trust resources. And then I question the moral imperative, because as tribes and tribal people are sharing in the burden of species imperilment, as well as the burden of species recovery, isn't there then a moral obligation to also include tribes in resource management decisions? So with that, I can take questions if we have time, but I do want to mention this issue of the wildlife professional. This was from 2010, where the entire issue takes a look at tribal wildlife management, both success stories and challenges. It has a lot of really great information in it, and I had an opportunity to be a part of this, so I was able to get about 10 copies to hand out today. So if anyone would like to take one of these copies back to their respective organization, I can get that to you. Thank you.